right, everyone. I'm super glad to be back. I was taking a fairly long, fairly long break over the holidays, but I have like a lot of topics like I want to be covering for like the next 2 weeks actually. So if you're interested in hearing about like stuff related to transformers, manifold learning, bundle adjustment, some compiler work, some proteins. I'm going to be talking about a lot of stuff. This video is going to be different from my typical ones. I'm actually going to be talking about this was a sort of a hit. I presented this presentation to some friends and family when I was back home. And the presentation is basically about like what is it like what is money, what is it really about? And so this may sound like sort of an innocuous question, but it's actually fairly complicated to even answer this. And so here's the reason why. Let's just get to it. So this is sort of what I call life on autopilot. So let's say you have a job and you're, I don't know, you're like a programmer and you work 9 to 5 and you do this for 30 years and you put a bunch of money in a bank account, like the number goes up and sometimes like the number goes down if you want to buy stuff. Um, so I call this like life on autopilot because you're just getting a number, but this number isn't really, it's not really clear what you're getting. Like as in, like what does this number really mean? Is it a debt? Is it a liability? Can you like why can't you get this number anytime? Why do you even have to put this number with other people? And so my point is like it's not really enough to just be an artist or nutritionist or programmer. Like also need to understand basic finance and basics of the tax code so you can avoid being broke. Um, so let's just go over like an example. So how do banks work, right? So with banks, like you deposit your monthly salary to a bank, and then banks they lend this money to others that want to start a business. This is effectively sort of similar to creating money, and then you get a percentage of your money back called interest, like basically the fee for you to like the risk, basically. Uh, but here's a very simple question, right? So if the banks don't make more money than the interest they give you, like what happens, right? Um, Basically the bank goes broke very quickly uh, because they don't like they're giving you money back that they don't really have. And any bank or business that does this is called a Ponzi. And so this is sort of like an old thing where you promise like outsized returns for something that you can't really provide. Hey, Krishnan, it's pretty good. Nice to see you again. Um, right. So I'll give you another example of like where people can, sort of like forget some basic stuff. So like credit cards, right? With credit cards, you get 3% cash back, right? How, right? Like is this free money? So from a consumer's perspective, like yes, this is indeed free money. So where is this money coming from? And the answer is if you've ever run a small business or a restaurant, you know that you have to pay the bank that fee. So then you may ask, like, well, why am I paying like 3% for the bank, right? Like, why don't I just like insist on cash or something? Um, so is this a long stream? This is gonna be probably like 30 minutes stream, but I'll be streaming like another time today on another topic on on graph compilers. Um, yeah, so where's the money coming from, right? Like, is it free money? And then you may ask, like, well, why would a restaurant give you free money back? And the reason and the answer is they don't do it willingly. They do it because a lot of like local municipalities will force restaurants to have credit card holders. So it's effectively, like a ratchet. Like there's a threat of violence where, or like a threat of closure of your business if you don't accept this. So it's sort of impossible to understand how banks work without understanding like the main idea behind a central bank. So a central bank is you can sort of think of it's a part of the government that's responsible for making sure that the banking system is stable. And then they do this really like they have one device that they can use to affect this, and it's called interest rates. So they can either increase interest rates or they can decrease them. And when they decrease them, they make borrowing cheaper. And that means it's easier for people to start businesses. Whereas if they increase it, then they would encourage people to save. Uh, so in practice, like the idea of a central bank is very commendable, right? Like if banks fail, what that means is that people lose their deposits, like their savings, their pensions, etc., and they get screwed. However, in practice, what happens is that they'll that central banks they don't really have the facilities to bail out individuals, and instead, what they'll do is they'll bail out like companies. And the companies that are closest to the government end up getting bailed out a lot more quickly. So this is called the Cantillon Effect. And the Cantillon Effect is the idea that money printing effectively benefits people that are closest to the printer, whereas everyone else in the economy would suffer from inflation. So if you go through like a bunch of econ texts, like they like sort of think the typical econ 101 books and that you maybe take in university or something, or if you're interested in the topic, like what is inflation? Why do we need it, right? So the idea is that over time, the purchasing power of money goes down. And you may ask, like, well, why do we do this? Like, why don't stuff get cheaper over time, right? Like, think, laptops. Like, laptops actually got cheaper. Like, they're better and they're cheaper. Uh, so why is it not the case, for example, for an education? Why have educations gotten way more expensive over time and are only affordable by a smaller percentage of people? So the idea behind inflation, like at least the potential benefit, is that it stimulates the economy in the short term by forcing you to spend your money, right? So like let's say if inflation is high, you'd rather spend money on a table today as opposed to in 10 years, which means that there's more money circulating and there's more people, like it increases employment. But the issue with this is that it encourages people to be in debt, and it becomes very difficult to plan for the future because if you're constantly in debt, if there's ever a crisis like coronavirus, suddenly all of a sudden like an entire economy goes broke, as opposed to just like whereas like you had cash reserves and you didn't care all that much about inflation. Then COVID happens. You're like, well, like it's okay. Maybe this year we'll just spend a lot less money or something, but you're not gonna straight up go broke. So a really important idea that people sort of forget about is like this idea of like the dollar, right? And so 75% of transactions all around in the world are done in the dollar, but the US only represents about 25% of the global GDP, which means that like anytime you're in any sort of you're in any bank, like let's say you're not in the US, like you're in India, you're in Switzerland, and you have a bank account that says you have dollars. What you should know is this is not actually dollars. This is a piece of paper that tells you that you have dollars, because if these banks make poor loans, they can't print dollars. There's only one country in the world that can print dollars. That's the U.S. government. And so I would highly caution you, like whenever you're depositing money in a country where the local currency is not dollars, like don't think of it as dollars. Um, so again, like blind trust will make you bankrupt, right? And so the whole reason I became interested in finance, like I was never interested in finance at all. I got interested in finance like last year when the Lebanese banking system crashed and my parents like lost their deposits. And so the idea there is that a lot of people had dollar accounts, but then the bank just told them like, well, you can't withdraw your dollars anymore, but they're still there. Like you still have a piece of paper that tells you, oh, you have dollars, you just can't withdraw it, which effectively means the dollars don't exist. And so, what I want you to take away from this is don't treat like money as this thing that some finance people need to understand. Like, you need to understand it because you're depositing your money. And so, if you spend 30 years working throughout your career, it's okay. You can spend like 30 days understanding like what money is, and it'll pay you dividends across your life. So how do people like so this idea of inflation, right? Like how do people protect themselves against this? So the worst thing you can do is just have like a bunch of like you could have a savings account where the number goes up a lot, and then you just like look at it. And the reason that's bad is because like let's say if you just assume a 2% inflation rate every year, like in 10 years you're going to lose 20% of your money, and in 20 years you're going to lose about 50% of your money. That's because interest compounds. It's not linear, right? So how do people protect themselves against this? Like real estate, like the stock market, having multiple revenue stream, gold, and more recently Bitcoin. I'm going to talk about like why this is important. Uh, and in general, though, like that, like the fact that inflation exists doesn't mean that you should have zero cash and just have assets, because your risk should be adjusted according to your age. And also correlated to that is your future income potential, right? Like if you're earlier on in your career, you can afford to take more risks. As you get older, you can't, because if volatility happens, then you're on the streets. Like that's never a position you want to be in. Like you never want to be in a position where you're broke. Like that's sort of like survive is lesson number one. Um, so, well, like again, like talking about inflation, let's flesh it out a bit. So the way inflation is typically measured is with this index called the Consumer Price Index. And so you take a basket of goods, like think like bread, corn, oil, and you measure its price fluctuation over the years. So if you look at these kinds of goods, roughly every year they inflate by about 2%. But here's an issue with this. So let's say the government, for example, is subsidizing certain goods, like let's say like oil, like that's subsidized in Lebanon or in Venezuela, for example. Uh, then you can say over time, well, there's no inflation in oil, therefore there's no inflation. The issue with this is that you can't think of inflation, I think, as a real number. I think consumer price index is a insanely misleading metric, and you should instead think of inflation as a vector. And actually, if you look at asset inflation, it's been a lot more than 2% a year. So, for example, think of what do you care about in your life? Like, what are the stuff that people care the most about? And what are the main reasons people go broke, actually? Like housing. Like, housing has grown a lot more than 2% a year, especially in scarce areas like think Bay Area, New York. Like, all these like competitive cities where people want to live. Education, like an education at Harvard has increased by a lot more than 2% every year. And healthcare, like if you break your leg, if you want to do open heart surgery, like that's also increased like more than 2% every year. And remember, these are costs that are almost impossible to avoid. You see, like it's not like you can think, well, it's okay, like I'm not gonna do healthcare. Like you can't decide that. Versus you can decide, for example, not to eat bread if you want to. Like, you're like, okay, I'm gonna eat rice or corn or whatever. You have like your choice of carb. Um, and so like typically the main lesson I think in terms of dealing with inflation. All right, so let's say like when I was saying like all of these increased by more than 2%, imagine that it's about 10% a year. So basically in 2 to 3 years you can lose like 50% of the value of money, which is absolutely insane. So how do typically like people like protect themselves from inflation is you invest in scarce goods. So money isn't scarce, like paper money isn't scarce because you can always print more. But other stuff like for example like alcohol, like wines, paintings, like originals, for example, not modern art, like classical art, preserves its value. Gold, etc. So all of these things are scarce, and that's why they preserve their value over time. So let's first talk about real estate, right? And so real estate, the main thing I want you to remember is that the first house you live in is not an investment because you can't actually sell it. So you can only sell houses if you have more than one. So your remaining houses are investments, and the reason why it's an investment is because you can't generate land out of thin air, right? But one thing to keep in mind now is that historically real estate has been a great investment because, well, you're paying rent anyway, right? And so why not just own a home with the mortgage? But typically, places where a real estate has really grown in value have been scarce places. So what's scarce, for example, in the United States, right? It's been city like the large cities. Okay, so where are the largest cities? Like they're all near the coast. Why? Because like real estate by the water is much more limited than the total real estate of the United States. The climate is also good by the coast, and there's also lots of companies by this coast. All of this like creates demand, and many cities, like including San Francisco, explicitly have laws that make it very difficult for you to create like new housing, and so this artificially makes the supply much lower than it actually is, whereas the demand keeps increasing, and when that happens, the price explodes. So another example I like giving, it's not like he's my favorite entrepreneur or anything, but like when you think of someone like Mark Cuban, for land versus house, as in land as house is not as valuable as land. Okay, yeah. So Christian is asking, can you comment on real estate value for land versus house, as in house is not as valuable as land? That is correct, actually. Land is more valuable, right? Because a house itself, like the goods in the house, like let's say the walls, the wood, all of this will depreciate over time, whereas like land won't, because it would need hardly any maintenance. That said, you can't live on land, and to buy land, you need to afford to buy land and also build a house. So it's something that like I would say richer people would care about versus if you don't have domain expertise in real estate, maybe just buying a house is easier. Hey Pseudomaze, nice to see you. Um, so yeah, so again, part of the like part of what I want you to think about with all of this is, you look at someone like Mark Cuban, right? Like he's already really rich, like from other investments. So why does this guy go on Shark Tank, and why does he always on CNBC, and why does he write, and why does he own a basketball team? And so this is sort of a core idea about like multiple revenue streams. And so the idea is, let's say there's ever a very severe crash in the market. Like let's say you have all your money in real estate in San Francisco. All of a sudden, COVID happens. Now, like all of your total net worth went down by 25% in 1 year, and it could go down even more the following year because like these things cascade. So you're screwed, even though you're paper rich. Like because you had everything in one basket, you're kind of screwed. Similarly, if you had all of your money in, like, let's say, Lebanese bank account, you were benefiting from 10% interest rates every year. All of a sudden, the banks like close. Now you have zero money. So to protect yourself against this, you can have multiple revenue streams. For example, like let's say you have a full-time job, right? You could also contract, you could have a company, you could angel invest, you could have a podcast, you could speak in public, you could host conferences, you can invest in the stock market, you could have a YouTube channel, you could blog. And so all of the idea is that even though in of themselves, like none of these may pay you a lot of money, they'll help ensure that if you completely lose out, like let's say, I don't know, you were a coal miner and then, no, now we're not mining coal anymore. If you can do like a bit more of all of the above, like it means that you're not going to be on the streets. And so a lot of it is this way, is thinking like, like you want to avoid like being on the streets. Um, so another way people protect themselves against inflation is with this idea called passive investing. So this became really popular with John Bogle, and like Warren Buffett's very famous for it, even though that's not really what he does for his own fund, like Berkshire Hathaway. But the idea is that let's assume that the US economy is going to keep going for the next 30 years. And so if that's the case, then you can buy a share in the 500 biggest companies in the US. That way, if they change, you're not really affected. You're just really betting on the US economy. And the other thing I think is really important to mention, like, well, why do the rich mostly have a lot of stock instead of income? Is in the US today, if you want to pay capital gains tax, like here I'm talking about the highest brackets, as in you made some money within the stock market, like, and then you want to sell that stock, you pay 15% tax if you held on to the stock for at least a year. Whereas if you have income, then you pay a 40% of your of your income. So let's say you make, you have a salary, it's like $1 million a year, and you're like, that's amazing, right? In the U.S., you would pay $400,000 to the government, and you would only make 600,000 yourself. Whereas if you had a company and that company grew to like grew to $1 million, one, you don't actually pay anything unless you sell anything. So let's say you're Amazon, right? Like he's a paper billionaire, right? Because he can't sell all of his Amazon shares immediately. But also, if he does sell some shares, let's say for $1 million worth of shares to pay for his living expenses, then you would only pay 15% tax. And so again, the nice thing about passive investing is that you don't need to talk to anyone. You don't need to talk to a broker or anything like that. You can just like download like the Vanguard app on your phone or go online, put in a like an amount that you want to put in, like let's say $10,000 or something, and then you just like basically wait for 30 years. And so that's like if you don't want to like follow the stock market or get stressed out, this is like a has been a reliable approach in the past. That said, uh, this may not be true forever. Like just because index funds have been great for the past 30 years doesn't mean they're going to continue being great for another 30 years. But it's just like sort of a school of thought that I think is fairly reasonable, and probably will be decent and won't lose you a lot of money and probably make you a lot of money. So another approach, for example, is that this idea of active investing. So the active investing, you're basically picking which stocks you think are going to grow a lot. And so there's lots of online brokerage accounts. Like the most famous one is Robinhood at this point. And so here the idea is that like active investing used to be that you would look at the price earnings ratio and you would say, well, which companies are undervalued? Today, most companies are vastly overvalued. So you look at a company like Tesla, its PE ratio is 1,300. And you can see here, for example, if you bought Tesla stock like around 2019, you would have like 10x your money. And so like instead of like let's say if instead of let's say I don't know buying a Tesla car, which is like for 50K, you bought like 50K worth of Tesla shares, you'd be retired. That said, like that's if you pick Tesla, right? Like there's yeah, we're gonna be talking like we're gonna be talking about Bitcoin and options in a second. Um, but basically here, I would say in general, people say like don't bother with active investing unless you know what you're doing. Uh, but I don't think it's a bad idea if there's companies where you feel like you have a unique insight. For example, like let's say you've spent over $3,000 on Amazon this year from between books and like various stuff for your house. then I'd encourage you to have at least $3,000 worth of Amazon shares, because the goods that you have in your house, like, yeah, they help you live, but it's not like they're going to grow in value. They decrease in value. So in general, like, I just encourage you, like, throughout your life, try to have more equity, like own more things as opposed to owning liabilities. Like, let's say a car, like a car is not an investment because over time it decreases in value. You have to pay to keep the car maintained. Whereas here, like, this is totally like, you just buy this, and then if you think like, well, like, I don't know, like some stocks I'm very excited about, for example, are Unity or Square Cash, but that's just me, and you shouldn't follow my opinion. Just make your own opinions. That said, this is a hard job. A lot of people don't encourage doing this on this side, um, but at the same time, it is fairly profitable. So it's up to you to decide like what your risk tolerance is for this stuff and how good you think you are at picking the winners. Here's some stuff I think you shouldn't bother with, like, right? So in general, don't get into stuff you don't understand, even if the returns look great. Like, try to understand it first. That way, like, you'll have a clear head when the volatility ends up, affecting you. Uh, Options I would not recommend, right? So let's say the options, for example, is one idea. Like, let's say around, like, let's say early 2020, right? A lot of people thought Tesla was really overvalued, and so they started shorting it. So shorting it means you're betting that the stock is going to go down, but if it goes up, it can go up an unbounded amount, right? Which means your losses can be unbounded. And so in general, like, why the hell would you ever put yourself in a position where you have unbounded losses? Like, you should be in a position where you have unbounded gains, which is the case if you invest in a growth stock. Potentially the gains are unbounded. Yes, you're gonna make more money with options, like, but I just can't fathom why anyone would ever put themselves in a position where they have unbounded losses. And the reason that's the case is because, like, the insanity in the market can outlast your solvency. Like, unless you're, like if you're a billionaire and you can afford to wait out losing money on your option contracts, like, that's fine. But if you have, like, less than 100K, you shouldn't be even thinking about this at all. Another thing you shouldn't be thinking about at all is bonds. So the idea with bonds is that you basically lend money to the government or a corporation. However, bonds today don't even keep up with inflation. Some bonds have negative interest, and so you're basically paying the government to lose money, right? And so don't do this. Like there's zero reason you need bonds like today. And the last thing I would say, like, this is sort of, I mentioned this point already, is like, don't invest in stocks you don't understand, right? So if, like, maybe let's say you're excited about genomics, for example, but you don't really understand what's going on, like, you don't need to invest in genomics. That said, if you want to invest a small amount, like, let's say, I don't know, $100 or $1,000 in genomic stocks, like something that's not going to make you like be on the streets in case it goes to zero, that's fine, because having some skin in the game will encourage you to learn more about the domain. Same thing as, having a job in that domain. So finally, like, let's say, so Pseudomay is wondering about Bitcoin, but it's impossible to talk about Bitcoin without talking about gold first. So, gold is basically universal money, right? Like, we've been using gold in our society for over 2,000 years right now. It's durable, like, it'll outlive you. It's portable, like, you can carry it around. It's a physical thing, to an extent, because it's actually pretty heavy. It's fungible because, like, any 24 karat bars of gold are relatively interchangeable. It's scarce because it's actually very difficult to mine gold. So the total amount of gold that gets produced every year, like, basically the flow, is fairly small. And it's basically been a universal way across societies to transfer wealth through time. So let's say, like, you have a newlywed bride, you'll give her gold because you're saying, like, look, I want you to preserve your wealth. Like, Arabic cultures, for example, or Indian cultures also are really big on gold even to this day, because we view this as a way to, it's sort of like a bankruptcy insurance, right? You're giving your children, like, this is like, I don't want you to be on the streets. Like, let's say your marriage doesn't work out. Like, it's okay. Like, you can always sell this jewelry. That said, the more artisanal effort goes into jewelry, so, like, typically the more expensive it is, right, when you're buying it, the less valuable it actually is when you're trying to resell it. And that's because the most valuable gold is bars, right? It's like the chunk, like, you just have a chain. So actually, for example, in Lebanon, if you go like 2 generations back, it was very common to just give, like, gold bracelets that had, like, nothing decorative about it, and you just, like, melt it. If you're interested in melting gold and how it works, like, I had a video about how to melt gold by Nile Red that I shared on my Twitter. It's super interesting, so check it out. So, but the thing is, like, people keep talking about, like, how hype gold was, right? Like, gold is the best thing ever, but gold failed, right? Like, we used to have on paper dollars here, you would say, like this is redeemable on gold at any Federal Reserve bank. So why is that not the case anymore, right? So the reason is it's not like there's two reasons, right? Like one of them is in 1971, the federal government in the U.S. made it illegal for you to hold gold, right? And so they confiscated people's gold. But there's another reason, right? The other reason is it's very difficult to transact internationally with gold. Like let's say you want to subscribe to my Twitch channel and you want to pay me in gold, then you need to go to UPS, put the gold, transport it, make sure it's safe. I need to get it, and at my end, I need to make sure this is real gold. And then once I know it's real gold, I can open up a service for you. This sucks, and it's almost impossible in an internet economy, which is why central banks started holding gold instead, and that they would essentially take the total transactions between two countries and then add them up, and this would give you like a plus or minus number, and then they would just send that payment once. So like sort of like a single escrow payment as opposed to sending it for every single transaction. So gold is easy to steal. It's really expensive to keep safe. Like if people know you have gold, you're gonna get robbed. And it's not easy to divide easily. Like let's say you go to a mall, for example, and you want to, I don't know, buy like some chewing gum. Like you need to come in and chip the gold. There's gonna be gold dust fall over. That's more money you're losing. So it was actually, I would argue, inconvenient both for users and governments. So instead of gold, what happened is in 1971, we moved away from what's called the gold standard. And basically, governments would hold gold for you and give you a piece of paper to redeem it. But then, before, in the past, it used to be backed 1 to 1. But over time, that incentive went away and it became a lot easier for governments to print money. So the benefit of this is that it allowed governments and people to transact internationally almost instantly, and it also made sure that it's almost impossible for governments to be bankrupt because if you can print money, you can always pay your own citizens with that money, and it's great because you can sort of keep on like the life of a government. But it sucks for regular people because I'll give you an example. Like let's say you're a war hungry general, right? But you really suck at war, so you spend a lot of money on war, but you're not making gold back by pillaging. Therefore, over time, you're just not going to exist anymore because you're going to be broke and you can't afford to keep doing wars. However, with current governments, because they can keep printing money, they can fund like whatever like stupid programs they have and never be bankrupt. And this is great for politicians, but it really sucks for regular people, especially people that save money in a bank account. For assets, this is fine because inflation is good for assets. But if you just have like a bank account with a dollar number going up, you're going to be really hurt by money printing. So finally, this introduces like the idea of why I'm personally very bullish on Bitcoin. So already here you can see this chart was fairly old. When the value was 10K, we're already at 30K now. And so you can think of Bitcoin as gold that you can instantly transmit through space, but also keep the value through time, right? So gold, you can send value through time. Paper money, you can send value through space. And then Bitcoin, you can send money through both space and time. And so the main idea here is that only 21 million coins will ever exist. And it's extremely volatile in the short term. So I would not recommend at all you day trade Bitcoin. I think it's a dumb idea. I would suggest take whatever, like sort of your savings, like whatever you're sort of willing to lose, but not really because I personally don't feel like it's going to go to zero. I think it's the most valuable, it's the soundest money ever created. And just hold it very long term and you're going to be good. And effectively, at this point, given that we're reaching all-time highs almost daily, this buying Bitcoin has never been a bad idea. Like even if you bought at the height of the mania in 2017, you would have made back like more than half of your money. And so what I really like about the Bitcoin community is that they have this idea of don't trust but verify. So you don't have to trust the bank to hold your money. You don't have to trust the central bank not to print too much money, but you can verify. And in fact, this is the code for the halving, which guarantees that the Bitcoin, like the new supply of Bitcoin created every day it gets divided by 2 every 4 years. Like this is the piece of code, and so you can actually go to your code. Whereas try to ask like if for how much money is on the central bank's balance sheet, like you're never going to get a straight answer to this question. Uh, Another point I want to make here is that you don't need to understand how it works to use it. As in, you can just like use an app like Cash App, and you can just say I want to deposit, I want to withdraw some money, and just use it the same way you used paper money in the past. And the point here is that people use paper money all the time without understanding how central banks work, without understanding how economics work. Uh, so here it's the same. However, I would argue that if you want to understand how economics, like central bank economics works, it's very complicated. Like you need to read several thousand-page textbooks. However, if you want to understand how Bitcoin works, like all you need to do is read the Bitcoin white paper, which is 8 pages long, and then you can verify the code. So I think I'll be doing like another video on the Bitcoin white paper later this week. It's very short. It's just 8 pages. It's very, very simple. And so I think it just like removes all the ambiguity from this, and just so you know at least what you're getting. So there's still some risks to Bitcoin. Like it's not like it's not free money, and effectively like there's no free lunches that exist. We could have strong taxation laws or bans, even though these are questionable because let's say Bitcoin, like the Bitcoin economy would move, let's say from the United States to Iran, for example. It could be that other cryptocurrencies are better, but so far to me nothing has emerged. Like I mostly view existing currencies, even like ETH, like Ethereum, as research projects. The reason I say that is because you can do all sorts of interesting stuff, but the main value proposition of Bitcoin is that it's basically money that you can't print easily at all, right? And so like there's never going to be a need for a more centralized currency or a less secure Bitcoin. And any new contender that says we're better is fighting like a losing battle, right? Because it's not just about the protocol, it's also about the ledger. The fact that we have a ledger that's about 11 years old now, that's never been hacked. We've never had like double spending. We've never had new coins be printed out of thin air, like illegally, right? The fact that none of these things have happened is sort of like a proof of Bitcoin's success, right? So any coin that comes in has to somehow beat Bitcoin, right? So if it comes in now, like it's sort of impossible to say whether it's good or bad until you give it at least like 11 years in the market. Uh, and I think the last thing, more from a user's perspective, is that with third parties, there's one benefit, right? Is that transactions can be reversible. So let's say I want to buy something for $10, but I accidentally sent the merchant $10 million. Then I can just call my bank and cancel the transaction immediately. Versus in Bitcoin, the transactions are not cancelable. So if you're doing this in online, like good luck getting your money back. And if you're doing it in person, there's still a credible threat of violence. If you're basically, if someone stole $10 million of my money, like you would get very angry and violent. So this still exists, but the third party is better at it, right? Like a bank or governments are better at violence or scaring you than an individual. Lastly, I want to briefly talk about this. So, there's been a lot of talk recently about government digital currencies. So, the idea is they're sort of like Bitcoin, but the supply creation is centralized. And so, today, like I said, with central banks, when the only thing they can do is they can change interest rates. So, they can either encourage people to spend or save more based on a number that they tweak. And they tweak this number by either printing money or collecting money and burning it. So that's how they do it in the paper world. In the digital world, it's basically they would adjust like entries in in the accounting system of banks. But they do this at a very coarse level, like right, they do this at an entire country's level. Whereas with digital currencies, what would happen is eventually, if you tie this in a social credit system, is like let's say if I don't think you're a good person, for example, according to some sort of social credit system, I would make interest rates very high for you. So like your money evaporates. Whereas like if you're a good person, I would make it easier for you to save. Or like let's say if you're young and you're at college and I want to encourage you to save, that's fine. Versus if you're 60 and you should be spending your money more instead of hoarding it, then I can increase interest rates for you. I think this is sort of like an extremely terrifying dystopia. And to me, this sort of again proves the case as to, well, like, once people get exposed to something like this, and they will, because this is very much more convenient for governments to work with than paper money, then that only makes the value proposition for Bitcoin stronger. Um, so the last thing I want to end with is that wealth really means that you can sleep peacefully at night. Don't think of it as a number that goes up. It means that you're never going to be broke. You're never going to have anyone rob you of your savings. It never means that you're too sensitive to some conditions in the world that are out of your control. So yeah, wealth is basically proportional to how well you sleep at night. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this. I think that's it for me. If you have any more specific questions, I'll be on for like another minute or two. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening. So are grads poor? What do you mean by grads? Because they don't sleep well at night. So yes, so the way I would think of graduate school, right, is if you view it as an investment of I'm gonna do this so that I can get a job, right? Then you're basically paying like a short-term cost to get a longer-term gain. And I think it's necessary for internationals. I don't think it's all that necessary for locals. Like I think they can just go work at big tech companies without needing to go to grad school. The thing about grad school, though, is like if we go back to the diversification idea here, is that if you view grad school as your grades and what your advisor tells you to do, you're sort of putting your eggs all in one basket. But in grad school, you have the luxury of you have a lot of free time, so you can blog, you can go out, you can make videos on YouTube, you can give conference talks, you can do whatever you want, you can have start side projects where you can make money from them. So if you treat grad school like this, I think it can be a great investment, even if the salary is low, just because you have time and basically a salary that can pay for your living expenses and heavily subsidized housing and mentorship. But if you view it as, I'm just going to go do what I'm told, I think it's a very shitty investment. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it. I'm probably going to be on later today talking about uh, like graph compilers. So stay tuned. I think it's going to be very interesting. And don't forget, I'm going to have um like a talk on the Bitcoin white paper soon. So yeah, so does investing in art make financial sense? Okay, that's a good question. So it depends. So if you're buying like let's say a Picasso painting, like I would say like that's only ever going to increase in value over time. If you're buying modern art, which is like let's say you're buying like a banana on a wall, for example, right? And then let's say this banana on the wall is valued at $10 million in a year. Uh, so you don't really know if this is going to keep being valuable, right? Because it's easily reproducible. Like anyone can put a banana on a wall. Not everyone can redo an original Picasso. It's much more difficult to forge, and you can actually validate the strokes of the original artists, like with X-ray techniques and stuff like that. So I think it makes sense if you're already very rich, but I think if you're not rich, it's something I would recommend you stay away from. So, any books you recommend about finance? Yes, there's a couple that I recommend. I highly recommend The Intelligent Investor by Ben Graham. So, I think this gives you a good idea to the like idea of passive investing and not investing in stuff that's overvalued. The second book that I would recommend is The Bitcoin Standard by Saifuddin Ammous, and it gives an amazing overview of the history of money uh, and like the idea of like why did gold happen, why did paper money happen, and how does Bitcoin fit in the story. And then the third thing actually I would recommend is reading a book, for example, on venture capitalism. So I think it was The Secrets of Sandy Road. Yeah, so The Secrets of Sand Hill Road. And the reason I recommend this is just because it gives you some better sense of how, like, venture capitalism is very similar to growth stocks. So, for example, if you're investing in something like Tesla, you're not investing in Tesla because it gives you high dividends and a lot of money back and because its stock is cheap. You're investing in Tesla because you think the stock is going to explode in popularity and it's going to become self-driving cars, that they're going to invent lithium batteries to have distributed solar networks that are going to power the whole world, that they're gonna have like underground tunnels so that you can go. So you're treating it much more like it's a speculative investment. So that's why I would recommend this. So like I said, there's also the Intelligent Investor. This is the classic book by Ben Graham. And the third books that I would recommend is the Bitcoin Standard by Saifuddin Ammous. Not because it's a book about Bitcoin. Actually, about 30, like maybe 50 pages or 30 pages of the book are about Bitcoin. It's really a book about the history of money that I think is very valuable. You can skim it, and you don't have to read the book in one sitting. Just like slowly read through it over the years, especially Intelligent Investor. I think I read it about 3 years after buying it, but I did end up, I think, after I left my job, I did sit down and read it cover to cover because I did think the lessons were valuable in it. All right, everyone. I think that's it for me. I'll still hang out in chat, but I'll probably stop the stream. So again, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time as always.